On October of 1849, a man was found wandering the streets of Baltimore, Maryland, delirious and talking nonsense. He was discovered by a police officer at around 4:30 in the morning, dressed in the clothes of another man. The man couldn't explain how he ended up like that and didn't know where he lived or even his own name. When the officer asked him his name, the man only replied, "Reynolds, Reynolds." That man would later be identified as famous author Edgar Allan Poe. 4 days later, the same officer received word to come to the Washington medical examiner's office because someone had died and they needed him to identify the body. Upon arriving at the morgue, he instantly knew it was the man he had found on the street 4 days before. But when he leaned over to take a closer look, the corpse opened its eyes and whispered the name Reynolds again, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Then, just 4 hours later, Edgar Allan Poe was dead. But what happened during those 4 days between being found on the streets and dying at the examiner's office? Or, even better, why was he calling out the name Reynolds? There have been many theories on what could have happened to him. So, today we are counting down the top 3 strange things that may have killed Edgar Allan Poe. At number 3, murder. It's hard not to think of murder when thinking of Edgar Allan Poe. His stories always have some sort of deathly tone to them, and that is exactly why some people believe he met his demise due to his writing. For starters, Poe's most famous story, The Telltale Heart, goes into great detail about a man whose heart beats louder and louder while trying to hide a murder. In fact, the entire story revolves around this man going insane while hiding a body underneath the floorboards of his home. Similarly, in Poe's poem, The Raven, the main character is also slowly driven insane by grief after losing his love, Lenore. Maybe it was Poe's habit of writing about insanity and death that led him to experience it himself. There have also been a lot of claims that Poe was murdered by his literary contemporaries. Poe had a rough relationship with some of the other writers of his time. In fact, he once said that there were 2 groups of people he hated, those who live on praise and those who live on envy. 2 writers who supposedly fit that description were Rufus Wilmot Griswold and Henry Fotheringham. Both men were literary critics who never seemed to offer Poe anything but criticism. They both published attack pieces shortly after Poe's death, which is suspicious since these pieces seem to have been prepared beforehand, almost as if they knew Poe wouldn't be around to defend himself. And to add to that, Griswold's piece contained a number of untruths about Poe's life. But the strangest thing is that Poe had actually predicted his own demise at the hands of Griswold in a letter he wrote to a friend, saying, "I have said this before, but shall repeat it, that I have never liked Griswold, and that the first intimation I had that he was an enemy was his very first notice of me as a writer, which appeared in a magazine called the North American Review, a quarterly conducted by a Mr. S.G. Goodrich, now of New York. This was about the year 1827 or 1828. It was a violent and very unjust attack, and having been made in a review which was considered the best of its kind in America, produced a very bad effect. I felt called upon to notice it in a general way through the press and did so pretty severely. Since then, Mr. Griswold has watched every opportunity to do me some evil office and has already done it in a great measure successfully. But there is another theory that might make a little more sense than Poe's colleagues wanting him dead. Number 2. Political kidnapping. Another theory on what killed Poe is that he was the victim of a political kidnapping gone wrong. See, Poe wasn't just a writer, he had his own political views and wasn't afraid to share them. In fact, he was very vocal about opposing the Democratic Party, especially their candidate for president in 1844, James K. Polk. That's why it ain't too far-fetched to believe that Polk's associates could have kidnapped him and gotten rid of him to stop him from speaking out against them. However, this theory gets a little messy when you try to figure out how it all went down. You see, Poe's brother-in-law, John Allan, had made some powerful enemies in Virginia while trying to buy back some family property. It's believed that those same men could have kidnapped Poe in retaliation against John. And while the kidnapping might have started out as a way to get back at John, things could have taken a turn for the worst and Poe could have been killed accidentally. But that still doesn't explain why Poe kept saying the name Reynolds, or how he ended up at the Washington Medical Examiner's office. It's possible that Poe was given a drug that caused him to hallucinate, causing him to wander the streets and eventually pass away. And then, as for the name Reynolds, it may have simply been a random name that popped into his head. But unfortunately, without any evidence to support it, this theory is nothing but speculation. And now for the number one strange thing that may have killed Edgar Allan Poe. At number 1, the curse. After hearing these other theories, you might start to wonder why anyone would think that Poe could have been cursed. Well, to answer that question, all you need to do is look at his writing. Many of his stories contain elements of the supernatural, such as ghosts, demons, and people being driven insane by forces beyond their control. One example is his story, The Black Cat, in which a man is driven to kill his wife after being taunted by a black cat. The story ends with the narrator finding the bodies of both his wife and the cat, revealing that the cat had somehow managed to survive with one eye hanging out of its head. Clearly, this story shows Poe's fascination with the macabre, and some people even say that this fascination of his may have been the cause of his demise. Maybe Poe wrote so many stories about curses and the supernatural that he attracted one. Or perhaps he attracted the attention of some entity while researching his stories. After all, he spent a great deal of time in cemeteries while writing, and some say he would dig up corpses to study their facial features. And it's no secret that messing with the dead can have negative consequences. Not only that, but there are plenty of examples in literature of authors being haunted by their own work. For example, author Stephen King was once struck by a van while out walking and almost died. He later realized that the accident was described in vivid detail in a story he had written called The Long Walk. But perhaps the most famous example of an author being haunted by their work is the legend of author Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Shortly after writing her novel, she began experiencing a string of bad luck, including losing her mother, sister, and 2 children, and her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, died at sea. It seems as though every time she turned around, she was faced with tragedy, which led her friends to conclude that she had unleashed some curse by writing the book. So maybe Poe suffered the same fate as Mary Shelley. Maybe writing about the darkness of the human mind and death over and over again caused him to suffer. In the end, all we know for sure is that Poe did die young under mysterious circumstances. And now, for the final part of this video, where we look into Poe's grave and find out if it really is haunted. Poe is buried at Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore next to his wife, Virginia. Over the years, people have reported feeling cold spots and hearing unexplainable noises coming from his grave. Not only that, but some have even claimed to see his ghost walking around the graveyard at night. But is there any truth to these claims? Well, there is a report from 1875 in which a woman named Helen Viola claimed that while visiting Poe's grave, she heard footsteps near his tomb, and when she looked over, she saw a mist rising from the ground. She also said that when she touched the stone, she felt cold and heard chains dragging metal moans. Even though she was the first person to claim that Poe's grave was haunted, she wasn't the last. Almost 100 years later, in 1969, a reporter for the Evening Sun decided to spend the night in Westminster Hall and Burying Ground to see if he could experience anything paranormal. And what do you know? He was able to capture the sound of chains dragging. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps the metal actually is dragging. We'll let you decide. So, what do you think? Was Edgar Allan Poe murdered, kidnapped, cursed, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. See you next time.